Okay, so this is our discussion of Simondon's individuation in the light of notions of form and information. We're just finishing part one of the book on physical individuation, and we're going to begin part two on vital individuation. So the last bit that we read last time and that we're going to continue to read now is sort of the conclusion of the last chapter of that first part. So the chapter where we've been dealing with quantum mechanics in some pretty in pretty good detail, and so the conclusion develops this notion of a relative individuation. So Simondon here argues that we should ascribe a degree of individuation to, or a degree of individuality to the particles that are discussed in quantum theory. And so there would be, rather than individuality being a sort of all or nothing property, it's something that comes in degrees. These degrees would be relative to the amount or the proportion of the pre-individual reality that is incorporated into that individual. And so something like a photon has only a low degree of individuation or of individuality because that photon concept is only really useful in certain particular domains. So in particular, the photoelectric effect that we discussed, whereas in other domains, the photon concept is not useful. And so in particular, when you talk about the wavelength of electromagnetic radiation, you can increase that wavelength indefinitely, and you can conceptually, you can go to the limit of a wave that would have an infinite wavelength, and so it would there would be no place for a photon concept with a wave with an infinite wavelength, and so and more physically or more pragmatically in the case of radio waves and other waves with long wavelengths, the photon concept is less useful compared to the ultraviolet radiation that is used in the photoelectric effect. So that's sort of where we ended up last time. I think we're at the first full paragraph on 161, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll start reading and I'll go through about a page or so and then we can stop there. The limits of the physical individual are also themselves metastable. An ensemble of fissile nuclei isn't really an individuated ensemble if the number of nuclei, taking into account the average radioactivity of the nuclei, is small enough for the fission of a nucleus to have little chance of provoking the fission of another nucleus. Everything happens as if each nucleus were isolated from the others. Each has its own chronology, and the fission occurs for each nucleus as if it were alone. On the contrary, if a large quantity of fissile material is gathered together, the probability for the results of the fission of a nucleus to provoke the fission of another nucleus increases. When this probability reaches unity, the internal chronology of each nucleus abruptly changes. Instead of consisting in itself, it forms a network of internal resonance with the resonance of all the other nuclei capable of fission. The physical individual is then the entire mass of fissile material and no longer each nucleus. The notion of critical mass gives the example of what can be called a relative threshold of individuation. The chronology of the ensemble becomes abruptly coextensive with the topology of the ensemble. There is individuation because there is exchange between the microphysical level and the macrophysical level. The capacity for the ensemble's reception of information abruptly increases. By modifying topological conditions, we can utilize nuclear energy either for abrupt effects through the gathering of several masses, each inferior to critical mass, or for continuous moderate effects by controlling the exchange between fissile nuclei by means of a controllable apparatus that maintains the ensemble below the unitary coefficient of amplification, for example, through the greater or lesser absorption of radiation. Consequently, it can be said that the degree of individuation of an ensemble depends on the correlation between the system's chronology and topology. This degree of individuation can also be called the level of interactive communication, since it defines the degree of the internal resonance of the ensemble. So yeah, this is the example that he introduced at the beginning of this section, having to do with radioactivity. And so this, just as a sort of background, so in the radioactive decay of a radioactive substance, there's a certain probability in any given time period that one of the nuclei of the substance will release a particle and release energy at the same time. And there's a certain probability that that particle will strike another nucleus and cause it to undergo fission as well. And so the denser the material, or the greater the amount of the radioactive material that you have in a given block or in a given mass, the greater the chance is that one of those particles will strike another nucleus and cause it to undergo fission. So then the chance for each individual nucleus to undergo fission increases because there's the greater chance that it's going to be struck by the particles emitted by the other nucleus. And then once you reach a certain critical mass, so once the amount of the radioactive substance reaches a certain threshold, then that probability reaches probability 1. So it's certain that the nucleus is going to undergo fission. And so these, based on the way that the radioactive material is either isolated from the environment, or whether it's allowed, or whether it's all sort of gathered together in one critical mass. You can either control the fission so that it's a low level of fission in the radioactive substance, which is what you do for generating nuclear energy in a power plant. You use the energy released by the fission to boil water and turn a turbine. Or you can also, of course, use radioactive material to produce a nuclear explosion when you have this uncontrolled fission of the critical mass. And so what Simondon is developing here is this notion that in the case where you have a mass of radioactive material that's below the critical mass, each nucleus has its own chronology. So it has its own probability of decay at any given time period. And then once you reach that critical mass, then the chronology of each nucleus is correlated with all the others. So this is what he describes as the correlation between chronology and topology. So the neighborhood structure of the material affects the chronology, the way that the chronology of each of the nuclei works. So they're not in isolation anymore. So that's sort of the background of what's going on in this paragraph. And one other point is that I think it's interesting that he's given us two different criteria for the degree of individuation of an entity. In the passage that we just read, he says that the degree of correlation between the chronology and topology would be the criterion for the degree of individuation of an entity. And then a couple pages earlier, on page 160, he suggests that, oh yes, here it is. So on 160, the first full paragraph, about a third of the way down the page. So he says, we could then speak of a more or less elevated level of individuation. An ensemble would possess a more elevated level of individuation in proportion to the greater amount of pre-individual reality it would envelop and compatibilize in its chronological and topological systematics, or in proportion to the difference between orders of magnitude. So the first criterion, or the second one in terms of the order in which he presents them, the one that is in the last paragraph we just read, the criterion there is the degree of correlation between chronology and topology. And then in the earlier one on page 160, the criterion for individuation is the proportion of the pre-individual reality that is enveloped by that entity. And so it's not obvious that those two criteria would coincide necessarily, that something that is that would be regarded as having a high degree of individuality on one criterion would necessarily have a high degree of individuality on the other criterion. So I think that's a bit of an obscure point where it would be helpful to have an argument why we should take these two criteria to coincide. But I don't think Simondon gives us that. Okay, so we can go on to the next page on 162 if someone else would like to read.
From this point of view, it seems possible to understand why the antagonistic representations of the continuous and discontinuous of matter and energy, of structure and operation, are not usable except as complementary pairs. This is because these notions define opposite and extreme aspects of the orders of reality, between which individuation is established. But the operation of individuation is the active center of this relation. It is the latter that is the unity of the center that splits into aspects which are complementary for us, albeit in the real they are paired by the continuous and transductive unity of intermediary being, what we call here internal resonance. The complementary aspects of the real are extreme aspects that define the dimensionality of the real. Since we can only grasp reality through its manifestations, when it changes, we only perceive extreme complementary aspects. But rather than the real, what we perceive are dimensions of the real. We grasp its chronology and topology of individuation without being able to grasp the pre-individual real that subtends this transformation.
We have, again, as Alyosha posted in the chat, we have this notion of internal resonance that we've seen throughout this first part of the book, which is explicitly introduced here. And this also brings back this thesis that Simondon had introduced, I think, at the beginning of this part, where he suggests that the complementarity of concepts that we have in quantum theory, so the wave particle duality, for instance, and then he suggests these other pairs of concepts like continuous versus discontinuous, matter and energy, structure and operation, that these are concepts that have to be used in this complementary way or in these pairs, because they don't grasp the reality itself. They grasp this, what he calls here the dimensionality of the real rather than the real itself. So in an earlier passage, he says that concepts as such, so in the specific sense in which he's using the term concepts are not capable of grasping individuation. So insofar as the real is a process of individuation, then we can't use concepts to grasp it. And in his other major work, the book on the mode of existence of technical objects, he uses the term intuition for the alternative mode of knowing. So through we know individuation or genesis through intuition. And I don't think we should understand that as some sort of mysterious faculty or anything like that. But the way he puts it in this book is that our knowledge of a transductive process, so a process of genesis, is itself an individuation in our knowledge. So we can only know individuation by undergoing an individuation. And this is also connected to the other thesis that in knowledge, the unit which is being individuated is not just the knowing subject, but it's the whole system, which includes both the knowing subject and the object known. So that whole system is undergoing a process of individuation, and that's what knowledge consists in. And so when we have that knowledge in that full sense, when we have that individuation of the total system, then we can grasp the real in its individuation in that process of individuation. But when we try to use concepts in the restricted sense to grasp the real, then we end up having to use these pairs of concepts that have this, as he puts it here, antagonistic representations of the real. That's sort of the, I think, what's going on in this passage. So Alyosha posted in the chat the comments about the internal resonance, which comes about when the capacity of the ensemble's reception of information abruptly increases, and suggests that this makes more and more indeterminate results possible. I'm not sure if that last bit is correct, because I think like in the case of the radioactive decay, the results become more determinate as you approach that critical mass. So once you reach critical mass, then you have you can predict when the fission is going to happen. Whereas when you're below critical mass, there's only a probabilistic prediction that within a certain time interval you have a certain chance of the radioactive decay happening. So yeah, I'm not sure if that lines up in the right way. And Aldreams posted also, there's a connection with Spinoza's third kind of knowledge. Yes, I think that's right, because the third kind of knowledge is a genetic knowledge. So Spinoza, if I remember correctly, he uses the example of knowledge of a circle, where if you just define a circle as a set of points that are equally distant from one point, then you have only the second kind of knowledge. You have a nominal definition of the circle. But if you define a circle by the line generated by rotating a line about a point, then you have a genetic knowledge of the formation of the circle. So you don't just have a nominal definition, but you have a real definition. And this type of knowledge Spinoza also calls intuitive. So it's not just it's not purely conceptual. It's some sort of immediate grasp of a truth. And it's a little bit mysterious, I think, in Spinoza, but yes, it's definitely related to the intuitive knowledge that Simondon talks about.
With this discussion here of this intermediary being, it seems like a kind of prototype for that would be the Spinozian substance. Only, I mean, I don't think Simondon wants to use those terms. And also I think in Spinoza is still probably a little too rationalist for him. I mean, we had that section earlier where he wasn't too happy with Spinoza. But it does seem like, to me, it seems like what we're looking at here is something like this Spinozian substance, only it's kind of its essence is becoming, rather than this kind of I guess a kind of identical being that Spinoza is after.
Yeah, I think that sounds like something along the right lines. And this is like the sort of project or ambition of making Spinoza dynamic or something like that. Like taking the Spinozistic substance and making it not something static, but something that undergoes becoming. That's a project that I think a lot of or at least a few different philosophers have taken on, and this was one of the sort of core ambitions in German idealism was, on the one hand, a recognition of the force of the Spinozistic system, but then also, on the other hand, wanting it to have something like becoming have something like becoming being integrated into substance rather than being ultimately an illusion or a lesser degree of reality like it is in Spinoza. And so I think Simondon can be understood as doing something similar, something along the same lines.
Do you not think, though, with the intermediary being, because this is kind of what I'm still grappling with, is that, like what I was saying before, are we misunderstanding determinate and indeterminate? Because maybe it has nothing to do with results in a statistical sense, but it's like an ontological statement of what they are. So like intermediary being, presumably, because he says it's continuous and transductive unity, calling it determinate would sort of make no sense, right? So this is why I'm going back to the idea of him multiple times talking about internal resonance from 159 onwards, and I guess just in my head trying to, maybe indeterminacy here is not about randomness, but about open-endedness and infinite extension. Because isn't this, when we just read in that section as well, the physical individual? Actually, I think this comes later when he starts talking about the living being in 167. But I think he'll distinguish and say that whereas the physical individual can sort of be infinitely extended, that's not the case with living being. Anyway, I still think I'm still puzzling over this thing that we talked about. Was it last week or the week before? And I feel like it's sort of being expanded here and maybe confirming that it wasn't a typo or a mistake. But
yeah, I mean, of course, the sort of default assumption is that it's not a mistake. So if we want to say that it is a mistake, then we have to make that case. But and I don't think I've done that in a sort of full sense. But my inclination is still to see that as a mistake, that he just put one word for the other in that passage that we talked about last week. But yeah, I think to make that case, I would probably have to write a paper on it, which I don't think I'm going to do. Okay, so we can go on to the next page or so. If someone else wants to pick up from 162, the second paragraph, information understood as the arrival.
Information understood as the arrival of a singularity that creates a communication between orders of reality is what we can think most easily, at least in several particular cases like free or limited chain reactions. This intervention of a notion of information does not, however, allow us to resolve the problem of the rapport of different levels of individuation. A crystal is composed of molecules. It requires the unity of energetic conditions, metastability, and structural conditions, a crystalline germ, for us to have a crystallized supersaturated solution. Can an individuated being, such as a molecule, which is already an edifice, intervene as a structural germ of this larger edifice, i.e. a crystal? Or instead, does it take a structural germ that is already of an order of magnitude superior to that of a molecule for the crystal to be able to begin? In the current state of knowledge, it is difficult to come up with a generalizable answer to this question. It can merely be said that the problem of the rapport of inert matter and life would be clearer if it could be shown that the living being is characterized by the fact that it discovers in its field of reality, structural conditions that allow it to resolve its own incompatibilities, the distance between orders of magnitude of its reality, whereas inert matter does not have this capacity of the autogenesis of structures. A singularity is required in order for the supersaturated solution to crystallize. Does this mean that inert matter does not increase its capital of singularities, whereas living matter increases this capital, since this increases precisely the ontogenesis of the living being and is capable of adaptation and invention? This distinction can only be given as a methodological hypothesis. It does not seem that we can oppose a living matter and a non-living matter, but instead that we can oppose a primary individuation in inert systems and a secondary individuation in living systems, specifically according to the different modalities of the regimes of communication during these individuations. Between the inert and the living, there would then be a quantum difference of the capacity for the reception of information rather than a substantial difference. If it exists, the continuity between the inert and the living would have to be sought on the level that is situated between microphysical reality and macrophysical reality, i.e., on the level of the individuation of systems like the large molecules of organic chemistry, which are complex enough for variable regimes of the reception of information to be able to exist in them, and restricted enough in their dimensions for microphysical forces to intervene in them as bearers of energetic and structural conditions. According to this conception, it could be said that the bifurcation between the living and the non-living is situated on a certain dimensional level, that of macromolecules, phenomena on an inferior order of magnitude, which are called microphysical phenomena, would in fact neither be physical nor vital, but pre-physical and pre-vital. The pure non-living physical would only begin on the supramolecular scale. It is at this level that individuation puts forth the crystal or the mass of protoplasmic matter. In the macrophysical forms of individuation, we indeed distinguish the living from the non-living. While an organism assimilates by diversifying, the crystal grows through the iteration of an addition of indefinitely ordered layers. But at the level of macromolecules, it can hardly be said whether viruses are living or non-living. To adopt the notion of information reception as an essential expression of the operation of individuation would be to assert that individuation is carried out on a certain dimensional, topological, and chronological scale. Below this scale, reality is pre-physical and pre-vital, since it is pre-individual. Above this scale, there is physical individuation, when the system is capable of receiving information a single time, then develops and amplifies this initial singularity by individuating in a non-self-limited way. If the system is capable of successively receiving several inputs of information, of combining several singularities instead of iterating the single and initial singularity cumulatively and through transductive amplification, then individuation is vital, self-limited, and organized.
Yeah, so there's a lot in this section. So maybe the first thing is this question about the structural germ that we've discussed a couple of times as it's come up in our reading. But the question is, in the process of individuation, the formation of the crystal, where does this structural germ come from? Because it seems as though we have to presuppose an existing crystal or an existing already individuated entity as the germ from which a further individuation can occur. But then, of course, that just pushes the question back one layer or one unit, because then we need to account for that first individual from which the crystallization process can occur. And we saw in the form information potentials discussion that Simondon sort of raises the possibility that there's something like a chance formation of the structural germ in the supersaturated solution. But he just raises the possibility, then he says something like it's difficult to accept this answer or something like that. He gives a sort of vague dismissal of that possibility that there's a role of chance in the formation of the structural germ. But here, the problem of the structural germ is related to the distinction between physical individuation and vital individuation. in the case of physical individuation, you have the structural germ, which or the singularity that brings that sort of imports information into the system, and then you have the amplification of that information in the structuring of the pre-individual field. So there's a sort of a one-time quality to this individuation process. So you start with an unindividuated field, and then you have the structural germ intervenes, and then you have an amplification across that field, which undergoes structuration. But after that process is done, then it's just individuated, and it's sort of inert in that sense. Whereas in the case of vital individuation, the entity that undergoes vital individuation retains this capacity to undergo further individuations and to incorporate information. So it's not just a single structural germ and the structuration of the field. It's an ongoing process of incorporating external information and undergoing individuation continually. So the difference between physical individuation and vital individuation is not it's not like two different kinds of matter. So he sort of raises this hypothesis that there would be a living matter and a non-living matter, but then he says that we should instead think of it as two different forms of individuation, so that the microphysical reality would precede the distinction between physical and vital individuation. So it would be a pre-physical and pre-living reality, which only subsequently undergoes individuation into something physical or something vital. Let's see, what else do we have?
I have something on that idea of the continuity.
Yeah, go ahead.
The inorganic and the organic. I read about this experiment fairly recently called the Miller-Yuri experiment, where these scientists at, I think, University of Chicago, in, I guess it was 1952. I don't know if Simone knew about this, but they took this liquid solution that had all these inorganic compounds and successively heated it to evaporate it, and then condensed it so that it went down through this chamber that shocked it with electricity. After which it condensed again, and they did this over and over and over again, and eventually the inorganic precursors formed like complex organic compounds. So I think that idea supports kind of what Simone is talking about here, with there not being a hard break between the non-living and the living, but rather a different form of organization of the same matter, I guess.
Yeah, to piggyback onto that, I posted a article by Dr. Hedda Hessel called Integrated Information Theory, and it's a study of sort of like information and consciousness that kind of posits that what we consider consciousness is sort of like on a scale of things that have both complexity and integration, and they sort of not as far as monism, but they kind of attribute some form of intelligence at some level to basically everything, and then the build up to what we consider like consciousness comes in increasing complexity and integration. and there's no like hard boundaries between what causes something to truly become like conscious.
Yeah, that's interesting. The experiment, I don't remember seeing that precise experiment, but I know in Origins of Life research, something like that is sort of the general approach, where you take materials that could plausibly have been around in the pre-life era of the Earth. So like carbon, hydrogen compounds, and you sort of make them undergo these physical processes that are also sort of plausible as having occurred in that environment. So ultraviolet radiation, I think, is one that is used, and then like electric shock in this experiment. And the hope is that you'll eventually see the formation of complex organic molecules through the sort of spontaneous processes that this sort of soup of chemical precursors is undergoing. And I think there have been a few different results that show that you do in fact get some complex molecules, and there are some, if I remember correctly, that that also showed membrane type structures, so that structures that are similar to the membranes of cells form spontaneously in these sort of chemical soups, and so I guess the takeaway or the message that we should draw from these types of experiments is precisely that there is a continuity between non-living entities and living ones, in the sense that there's no difference in the composition of those entities. The difference between living and non-living has to do with the way that that matter is organized. And there's also, of course, what Simondon alludes to here is the border cases. So something like a virus. Like a virus is basically just a bunch of RNA inside a protein package, and so a virus outside of a living organism is inert. It doesn't do anything on its own. It doesn't have a metabolism. But once it's inserted into a living organism of the right kind, then it basically hijacks the cellular machinery of that organism and makes it produce copies of itself. And you have the same thing with prions, which are basically just protein structures that again are inert if you take them outside of an organism. But in organisms of the right kind, they reproduce themselves by basically transforming other proteins into that structure. So they again, reproduction is generally considered one of the sort of fundamental qualities of living being, but it's here exhibited by something that doesn't seem to be living by other standards. So that, yeah, we have these borderline cases that you can't really say are they alive or not, because they have some of what we consider essential properties of living beings, but then they also lack other properties like metabolism. So this also shows that there's, or it suggests at least that there's no, that there's a continuity between living and non-living, and these borderline cases would be somewhere in the middle. And the integrated information approach to consciousness yeah, something that I don't really know a lot about, but it I think it does fit in well with this with Simondon's general understanding of individuation, in the sense that that internal resonance, or the correlation, is always what he brings up in connection with individuation, and so it would make sense that that something like the integration of information would correspond to individuation in well, this is what we'll eventually get to with psychic individuation. But again, there would be a continuity between entities that do have psychic individuation and those that don't. It wouldn't be a sort of yes or no property. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. I can read this part, and I think that will take us to the end of the chapter. Right. Okay, bottom of 163. It is customary to see in vital processes a greater complexity than in non-vital physical-chemical processes. However, to be faithful, even in the most hypothetical conjectures, to the intention that animates this research, we will suppose that vital individuation does not come after physical-chemical individuation, but during this individuation and before its fulfillment, by suspending it at the moment when it has not reached its stable equilibrium, and by making it capable of expanding and propagating before the iteration of the perfect structure merely able to repeat itself, which would conserve in the living individual a bit of pre-individual tension, of active communication, in the form of internal resonance between extreme orders of magnitude. According to this way of viewing things, vital individuation would come to be inserted in physical individuation by suspending its course, by slowing it down, and by making it capable of propagating in the inchoate state. The living individual would be, in some sense and on its most initial levels, a crystal in the nascent state that is amplified without stabilizing. To relate the schema of interpretation to the most current notions, we can appeal to the idea of neoteny and generalize these types of rapports between classes of individuals by supposing a slew of possible neotenic developments in the category of living beings. In a certain sense, animal individuation can be considered more complex than vegetal individuation. However, the animal can also be considered an inchoate plant that develops and becomes organized while conserving the motive, receptive, and reactional possibilities that appear in the reproduction of plants. If it is supposed that vital individuation retains and expands the most precocious phase of physical individuation, such that the vital would be the physical in suspense, slowed down in its process and indefinitely expanded, it can also be supposed that animal individuation is nourished by the most primitive phase of vegetal individuation, which retains within it something prior to its development as an adult plant, and more specifically, maintains a capacity for receiving information over a much longer period of time. Thus, it would be understood why these categories of increasingly complex but also increasingly unfinished and decreasingly stable and self-sufficient individuals require more complete and more stable layers of individuals as an associated milieu. Living beings require physical-chemical individuals to live. Animals require plants, which are for them, in the proper sense of the term, nature, in the same way that chemical compounds are for plants. Yeah, so there's this notion of neoteny, which he uses here. And so this refers to evolutionary history in which what at one stage is a juvenile form sort of replaces the adult form at a later stage of the evolutionary history. And Alyosha has posted the picture or the gift there of an axolotl, which is an amphibian, which doesn't undergo the transformation or the metamorphosis from the larval stage to an adult stage. So it basically corresponds to a tadpole that never becomes a frog. And Simondon takes this as sort of the model for the relationship between, on the one hand, living or vital individuation and physical individuation, and then within vital individuation between the individuation of plants and the individuation of animals. So in each case, we have a relation of neoteny the process of development or of becoming is slowed down. It is not allowed to reach its completion, and that's preliminary stage or that early element is preserved in the further development. And so again, we have this relationship with chronology. So the relationship between physical individuation and vital individuation is a chronological one, in the sense that vital individuation is a slowed down process of physical individuation. And I really like this bit where he says that an animal can be considered an inchoate plant. I think that's a really powerful image. So the plant in general has these motive capacities only as a seed. So the seed is mobile and in the sense that it can be carried by the wind or by an animal or something like that. And then once it takes root, the plant is fixed in that location. Whereas the animal preserves that capacity for motility throughout its lifespan. So it's as if the seed of a plant, rather than taking root, continued to live as an independent motile entity. It's probably also worth mentioning, Simon doesn't mention this here, but it's generally accepted within the study of human evolution that humans underwent a process of neoteny. When you look at the mammals as a whole, there's in general a linear relationship between the size of an animal and its gestation period, so the period of pregnancy. But humans fall far below that line, that linear relationship. So, like, if humans were in line with this linear relationship between size and gestation period, then human pregnancies would last something like 18 months, I think. And so, in a sense, humans are born earlier than other mammals are, relatively speaking. And so humans are born, of course, in a pretty helpless state, whereas deer, for example, are born able to walk within a few minutes or hours. So there's humans are born early in comparison with other mammals, and so this same relationship occurs in human evolution as well.
And the idea that he was talking about in the last thing that we read, about living individuals increasing their capital of singularities, and also this bit in the last section about living beings requiring physicochemical individuals to live, sounds a lot like Schrodinger's definition of life in that 1945 lecture, I think in Dublin, called What is Life?, where he defines life as by the fact that it has to consume neg entropy in order to fend off its own entropy.
Yeah, this is and this is also related to what we were talking about earlier about origins of life research, because living beings are open systems, so they always they have to absorb energy and matter from their environment. They're rather than closed systems, which would be isolated from their environment, and it's precisely because they can absorb energy and matter from their environment that they can stay far from thermal equilibrium, whereas a closed system would tend to evolve towards a thermal equilibrium, in which case there would be no capacity for work. So it's ultimately it's the constant stream of energy coming in from the sun, which is the precondition for the possibility of life to Spatai makes a lot of this notion. But the energy coming in from the sun is the source of the possibility of life. in Bataille, this is in the Accursed Share. He develops this whole account of life and social organization in terms of the absorption or managing this excess energy. And so he suggests that we should understand life as being basically a sort of excrescence of the earth to use up its excess energy, and this actually pretty well corresponds to the origins of life type of research into these sort of far from equilibrium systems, so that there is something like a spontaneous formation of structure in systems that are absorbing energy in the way that the Earth as a whole is. So I think that's it's a pretty cool region of science.
So I'm trying to understand the way he was thinking about the difference between physical and vital individuation here. So there's that bit here. According to this way of viewing things, vital individuation will come to be inserted in physical individuation by suspending its course, slowing it down, making it capable of propagating in the inchoate state. The living individual would be a crystal in the nascent state that is amplified without stabilizing. And I guess the way I'm reading that is, so thinking back to the crystal, and the seed is dropped and the crystallization process begins, and it seems like each layer of crystal formation ends up stabilizing, right? That seems pretty straightforward until the entire supersaturated solution is individuated and becomes stable. And it seems like with life, I'm thinking of it as almost like a kind of loop, like a kind of loop has formed, so that no layer is actually finally stable, but maybe it's some kind of like the separate layers become related to each other in some way, and almost like keep each other in tension, and in a kind of I guess that's how I'm reading this talk of kind of an internal resonance or active communication. It seems like with the crystal, what happens is the tension is kind of used up, right? And it seems like life has the property of resisting that using up of the tension, so that it kind of maintains its own internal tension. And then there would be some interesting connections here too with I think Freud thinks about life in similar terms, like in terms of a kind of internal tension that's maintained, or I guess a kind of balance between maintaining that tension but also releasing it, because releasing the tension would bring pleasure. But yeah, it's almost like what he's trying to explain here is there's a kind of internality, or in something inward about life. And I vaguely remembered that kind of thing actually coming up in the introduction, I think.
Yeah, I don't remember that in the introduction, actually. I think he may have mentioned this notion of vital individuation being a slowing down of physical individuation, but I don't remember him talking about internality or something internal to life being mentioned in the introduction. But yeah, the connection with Freud is interesting too, because so in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he talks about this sort of notion that life it has a sort of tendency towards the release of tension, so that pleasure is comes about through that release of tension, but the ultimate release of tension, of course, is death. in which all the tensions are released or are not existent anymore. And so there has to be this sort of balance between the tension and the release of tension, I think it wouldn't be hard to try to make connections with what Simondon was talking about here to Freud, which would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I guess the way I'm anticipating project is, it seems like complexity will be essential for him in explaining life. This kind of multiplicity of levels, mutually communicating levels of, I guess, relation. And I guess the contrast case, the thing that he's deliberately not doing, right, would be the way Platonism would go. Because from, my understanding of that way of thinking, life is a kind of form, right? Life is a kind of idea or something absolute that, it's almost like it's blasphemy almost, to try to explain life in terms of material processes or, in terms of lower non-living matter. And so it's interesting how, from that perspective, it seems like Simondon, I'm tempted to fit him into that movement of adverting Platonism, right? That Deleuze also participates in, and I probably Nietzsche is certainly a part of as well, where there is a kind of bottom-up explanation rather than, top-down idealism of like absolute ideas or whatever. And it seems like the way Simondon is doing that is with this kind of infrastructure of multiplicities of levels. His vocabulary is really complex, and it seems like, that's the work that it's doing, right? So the multiple levels, the resonances, the communications, the disparate orders, all of that seems to be a way of, how do we explain these phenomena, such as life? I guess that's what's coming up, within the context of a kind of immanence, an immanence system, without bringing in transcendent entities or forms, or which I guess is that would be the fallacy he's been challenging all along, right? Like substantialism.
Yeah, with Plato, it's always hard to, I guess, pin down a particular doctrine and say this is Plato's doctrine, because what I'm thinking of here is the Timaeus, which on the one hand does give something like a materialist account of the structure of the universe. The universe is composed of these different atoms of the different elements, which have the geometrical forms that correspond to earth and fire and air and so on. So yeah, the Timaeus has this sort of quasi-materialist account of the different elements of the universe. But at the same time is also it's structured around this demiurge figure that imposes these forms, or that puts the universe into this structure. So yeah, I think it's probably a bit more complicated in Plato, the relationship between some sort of bottom-up type of explanation and this top-down form of explanation. But yeah, I think Simondon can be put into that same sort of quasi-vitalist tradition, like Nietzsche, Datsun, and then later Deleuze, which wants to, so it's vitalist in the sense that it wants to recognize a sort of reality to the living being, or a specific reality to the living being. So living beings are not simply composed of, or they're not reducible to chemical operations or something like that. So there's something about life that is beyond that, just chemical operations, but at the same time wanting to understand that reality of the living as arising out of the non-living, and not as something that sort of transcends the non-living. And yeah, Schelling would be another person that we could put into that same tradition. And the connection between Schelling and the sort of later version that we find in like in Bergson or something like that, I think it would be, it's something that's not really been researched that much, I don't think, like in terms of whether there's an actual sort of direct line of inheritance of these ideas, or if it's just more of like a vibe, I guess we could say. But yeah, that would be interesting to look into. And I think Simondon in particular, like I know for sure that like in his in one of the annexes to this book on the history of the notion of the individual, he does mention Schelling there, and I think there's a lot of points where we can at least hypothesize that he's drawing on Schelling. But yeah, that's sort of an aside. Okay, so let's go on to the next part. So we finished part 1 of the book on physical individuation, and we're going to start part 2 on vital individuation. So we have chapter 1, information and ontogenesis, vital individuation. Then under that we have section 1, toward the study of the individuation of the living being, and subsection 1, information and vital individuation, levels of organization, vital activity, and psychical activity. So I can read the first page or so, and then we'll rotate from there. Physiology poses the difficult problem of levels of individuality depending on the species and according to each being's moments of existence. The same being can in fact exist on different levels. The embryo is not individualized in the same sense as the adult being. Furthermore, in fairly related species, there are behaviors that correspond to a more or less individualized life, depending on the species, without these differences necessarily seeming to be linked to a superiority or inferiority of vital organization. To shed some light on this, it would be helpful to define a measure for levels of individuation. However, if the degree of individuality is submitted to variations in the same species depending on the circumstances, it is difficult to measure this individuality absolutely. It would then be necessary to define the type of reality in which individuation takes place by saying with which dynamic regime it is exchangeable when the level of organization does not vary throughout the whole system that contains the vital unit. Then we would obtain a possibility of measuring the degree of individuality. According to the methodological postulate that we just defined, it will be helpful to resort to the study of integration in systems of organization. In fact, organization can occur either in each being or through the organic relation that exists between different beings. In the latter case, the internal organization in the being is duplicated by an external integration. The group is integrative. The only concrete reality is the vital unit, which can in certain cases be reduced to a single being, and which in other cases corresponds to an extremely differentiated group of multiple beings. Furthermore, the fact that an individual is mortal and not divisible by fission or regenerable through protoplasmic exchange corresponds to a level of individuation that indicates the existence of thresholds. Unlike physical individuation, biological individuation takes into account the existence of the whole species, colony, or society. It is not indefinitely extendable like physical individuation. If physical individuation is unlimited, we must seek where there is a transition between physical individuation and biological individuation. Yet the biologically unlimited is found in the species or in the group. What we call individual in biology is in reality something like a sub-individual, much more so than an individual. In biology, it seems that the notion of individuality is applicable to several stages or according to different levels of successive inclusion. But analogically, it would be necessary to consider the physical individual as a biological society, and the latter alone would be the image of, albeit very simple, totality. The first consequence of this manner of thinking establishes that the level of organization contained in a physical system is inferior to that of a biological system, but that a physical individual can possibly have a level of organization superior to that of an individual biological system, integrated into a vaster ensemble. Nothing is theoretically opposed to the fact that there is a possibility of exchanges and alternations between a physical system and a biological system. But if this hypothesis is valid, it will be necessary to suppose that a physical individual unit transforms into a biological group, and that what makes the living being appear is in a sense the suspension of the development of the physical being and its analysis, not a synthetic relation which unites completed physical individuals. If this is the case, then we will have to say that only very complex physical edifices can transmute into living beings, which truly limits the possible cases of spontaneous generation. According to this view, the unit of life would be the complete organized group and not the isolated individual. This doctrine is not a materialism, since it supposes a sequence leading from physical reality to the higher biological forms without establishing a distinction between classes and genera. But if it is complete and satisfactory, this doctrine must be able to explain why and in what sense there is the possibility of inductively observing the genus-species, or even the species-individual relation. This distinction must be situated in a broader reality that can account for both the continuity and the discontinuities between species. This discontinuity seems comparable to the quantum characteristic that appears in physics. The criterion of syncrystallization that allows us to recognize chemical species by indicating in which system they crystallize indicates a type of rapport of real analogy founded on an identity of ontogenetic dynamism. The process of the crystal's formation is the same in both cases. There can be a sequence during the growth of a crystal composed of different chemical species, so that its growth is continuous despite the specific heterogeneity of the different levels. The unity created by the continuity of an operation of individuation that encompasses species which seem heterogeneous to one another, according to an inductive classification, indicates a profound reality pertaining to the nature of these species as rigorously as what is called specific characteristics. The possibility of syncrystallization does not, however, indicate the existence of a genus, because, starting from the criterion of syncrystallization, we cannot go back down to the particular characteristics of each syncrystallizable body by adding on specific differences. Such a property, which indicates the existence of a process of information during an operation of individuation, does not belong to the systematics of genera and species. This property indicates other properties of the real, properties which the latter presents when we consider it relative to the possibility of the spontaneous ontogeneses that can occur in it, depending on its own structures and potentials. Right, so the problem that we face immediately when we turn to vital individuation is the fact that this degree of individuality is variable within the lifespan of an individual entity, so that we have like the example he gives here is that embryo is not individualized in the same sense as the adult being, and then it's also variable depending on external circumstances. And we'll see as we continue in this chapter that he's going to give examples of particular animals that have both a colony form and an individual form. So corals, for example, have varying degrees of individuality. They sometimes share nutrients between between what you could consider individuals. So they have a shared circulatory system, and so they're not fully differentiated from each other. And so we have this problem of how do we define the degree of individuality of a living being. And so the suggestion here in this on 167 is there's a question here: which French word is translated as individuality? It should be individualité, but individualité. Right. So the suggestion that Simondon gives, or the postulate that he gives, is that we can only define a level of individuation or a degree of individuation relative to a certain dynamic regime. So an exterior environment within which the level of individuation does not vary. So once we set the background conditions, then we can define the degree of individuation relative to those conditions. But so this degree of individuation is always relative in that sense. And then so he introduces again this what he just introduced, or what he just brought up in the conclusion of the last chapter. So the fact that physical individuation is unlimited, or potentially unlimited, in the sense that a crystal has no determinate size. It will just keep on crystallizing the solution as long as there's more solution to crystallize. Whereas physical vital individuation is limited in terms of size, so that a particular kind of plant or animal or a bacteria or whatever it is has a determinate size range in which it occurs, and so it can only and then so it's limited in space in that sense, and then also vital individuation is limited in time in certain cases, not in all cases, but when you reach multicellular organisms, there's a time limitation on the process of individuation, so that the entities have a certain lifespan, which is again within a certain range, but it's not it can't reproduce itself indefinitely in the way that a crystal can continue to individuate indefinitely as long as it has the environment to do so.
I was reading this really interesting article because we were just talking about like lifespans of things. That almost every mammal within like one standard deviation lives for about the same amount of heartbeats.
Yeah, I've heard that before. So like there's a correlation between the size of a mammal and its resting heart rate. And so smaller mammals have shorter lifespans, but they have a faster resting heart rate, and so and then larger mammals have a longer lifespan in general, and they have a slower resting heart rate, and so the total like the heart rate times lifespan comes out to roughly the same across all mammals. So yeah, that's an interesting biological law, I guess you could say. Biology often is presented as not having something like an equivalent to laws of physics, but that is something that we could compare at least to laws of physics.
And another thing that was interesting to me about this section is how sort of like the sizes of certain life forms are like not just like limited in like the practical sense of like what their physiology can support, but that very limit is like determined by external factors to the life form itself. You look at like I don't know how much of this is like recent discovery versus like what was known when Simondon was writing, but uh when the oxygen content on Earth was significantly higher than a little over 20% of the air, that like there were insects like the size of humans and bigger running around, like dragonflies the size of cars and shit. There's an extinct animal, the giant North American grizzly. It was like 30 feet or something tall at the haunches, a grizzly bear that roamed North America at the time. When the world just allowed for bigger things to exist due to like the external milieu and limits.
Yeah, this is exactly what Simondon was talking, or another instance of what Simondon was talking about with this idea that individuation is relative to a particular environment, so that these different species that are able to exist in one environment are not able to exist in another environment. And then even beyond that, you have like with particular kinds of like the corals that I mentioned, animals that depending on their environment, they can exist either in an individuated state or in a collective or colony form. And we'll see more examples of this, but there are like certain kinds of amoebas, I think, if I remember correctly, that they live generally in a sort of individual state. So each individual amoeba just swims around and does its own thing. But then if the environment is depleted of nutrients, they aggregate together and form like a little mini tower of amoebas and produce something like a spore, which travels to another environment, and then they spread out again in that new environment. So what at one level looks like an individual, then in a different environment turns out to be or acts as a component of a larger individual. And so, yeah, we have this relativity of degrees of individuation to an environment.
So I'm trying to understand this manner of thinking of Simondon here, like he calls it. And so a couple of things are interesting. So in the first, or I guess it's the second paragraph, he says, we would obtain a possibility of measuring the degree of individuality. And it's interesting how individuality has a degree. And I don't know if that's going to be unique to life or if that was also the case, probably was, I guess, with physical individuality. But that's interesting. And so later he also says, I mean, again, kind of reiterating, we're not talking about species and genera here. That's not the manner of thinking, right? That kind of Aristotelian, I guess the Platonic logic is probably already on the way towards species and genera. And that's not what we're doing here, right? And we've seen that already, I think, multiple times. And so I guess I'm wondering, okay, what is the manner of thinking, or what is the kind of logic that's involved here? And I'm wondering if maybe what's going on is we're in the kind of in the sphere of what are called intensive magnitudes. I don't know, maybe that goes without saying, but to me, so this idea of a degree, the degree of individuality. So I think in Kant, in the first critique, degree is intensive magnitude, right? And it's interesting because, so I think when we're talking about species and genera, we're basically in the sphere of qualities, right? That are kind of unto themselves, like separate substantial qualities. And I think Simondon actively is, resisting that way of thinking, right? Which is, I guess, broadly Aristotelian. But then also, we're not talking about just like any ordinary quantity either, right? Like extensive quantities. I don't know, maybe extensive quantity is more proper to physical individuation. I don't know. But this talk of degree and measure, to me, is speaking of, so I think Hegel defines measure as the unity of quantity and quality in the logic. And I wonder if Simondon is moving in that kind of direction, right? Something like measure is also connected with this idea of a threshold or kind of significant cutoff point, or but yeah, something about like maybe intensive magnitude might make sense here. Just as a, I don't know. I guess I'm always looking to sort of, like I seem to need a map because the territory, Simondon territory, is just so like I'm lost from like the first moment. So I guess I'm always looking for a map of some kind.
Yeah, I think that so you're right that the mode of thinking here is not one in terms of species and genera, because that's a form of thinking that Simondon has criticized on a number of occasions. But he also says here on what page is that? 168, about 3/4 of the way down in that last paragraph. So he says that his doctrine has to be able to explain why and in what sense there is the possibility of inductively observing the genus species or even the species individual relation. So we have to, even though correct way of understanding the biological or the living individual, we still have to account for the appearance. We still have to give some sort of account for why genus and species thinking might seem appropriate for thinking the living individual, and so this is again something like this relationship between the continuous and the discontinuous, so that there, and we saw this with chemical substances in the previous part, where he suggests that we can have something like a genus and species classification of chemical substances in terms of their crystalline structure, only insofar as there's these discontinuities between the different substances in terms of their properties. So the existence of these discontinuities in properties is what underlies the possibility of a classificatory approach to the particular subject matter, whether it's crystals or living entities. And so so there's I'm not sure how exactly that connects to intensive magnitudes, though. I think because some of the properties that he's talking about are extensive magnitudes, like when he talks about the way that a living being has a determinate size or a determinate range of sizes that it can reach, as opposed to physical individuation that has no limits. So that's an extensive magnitude, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if some of the properties that he has in mind could be intensive magnitudes as well. Yeah, that's something that I think we'd have to come back to because I'm not really sure. One sort of weird point to me, at least, or obscure point, is in that same paragraph at the bottom of 168. So he says, this doctrine is not a materialism, since it supposes, so this doctrine is his doctrine, the one that he's arguing for. So this doctrine is not a materialism, since it supposes a sequence leading from physical reality to the higher biological forms without establishing a distinction between classes and genera. This to me is weird. Like, why does not establishing a distinction between classes and genera make it not a materialism? Or what is the connection between materialism and a doctrine of classes and genera? I don't really know what the connection is that he's drawing here.
Yeah, I thought that was confusing too, and I think later on he talks about materialism as a, I guess, a school of thought that posits a hard distinction between the inorganic and the organic, but I don't know why he calls that materialism.
Wouldn't it just be going back to it's the whole realism idealism thing that even goes back to Bergson, right? That in a crude kind of materialism, it's like you're dealing with an already individuated system, and you're trying to restitch seemingly distinct individuals together to form this synthesis, when in actuality that there's already this whole prior stage at which things were decomposed into what appear to be individuals or separate discontinuities. So that's how I read that. It's not a materialism because maybe for Simonon materialism would be without any qualifications, would be a kind of crude phenomenological realism where you're just observing sort of external phenomena and linking them together with various intellectual and conceptual relations that somehow explain all the causality between them, instead of his whole analogical transductive thing where there's a kind of a continuity between all of these things through different milieus and stuff.
Yeah, that could be. It still seems weird to me that he uses the term materialism for this doctrine that he's opposing. In earlier portions of the text, when he talks about materialism, he's or I actually don't remember if he uses the term materialism, but he refers to the ancient atomists as an example. I can't remember if he actually uses the term materialism there. That's sort of what comes to mind when we talk about materialism, is the ancient atomists, and that. I mean, I don't think there's anything in Epicureanism, though, that requires a doctrine of classes and genera, or that presupposes this type of classificatory thinking. So yeah, it's still weird to me. But yeah, I think we might have to leave that problem open, or at least wait until we find other passages where he talks about materialism, and maybe that will shed light on this passage. So we're getting close to time. I'm thinking maybe we should stop here rather than reading another paragraph, because we won't have much time to discuss if we do that, unless someone is dying to read the next paragraph now. Okay, not hearing any objections. So so we're at such are the properties on the middle of 169. So we'll pick up from there next time and see if we can figure out what's going on with materialism. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. We had a good discussion today, I think. Yeah, I'll see you all next week.